Well, what a time it would have been to be alive. Time Neanderthals and woolly mammoths and saber-toothed tigers were roaming around.
I do really wish I got to see those big old megafauna that were roaming back in the day, but unfortunately, they're gone.
Yeah, unfortunately, we live now where we don't have to worry about being mauled to death by gigantic animals.
That's a good point. But you know, we're discovering more and more each day, some pretty disturbing, and we've got that for you here. Starting off our list today, we have the fact that Neanderthals often partook in cannibalism, but not for the nutritional value of their fellow man. So then why was it common practice for Neanderthals to eat other Neanderthals? Well, scientists have a few theories, but first let's talk about how they came to the conclusion of cannibalism in the first place. Cut marks made by stone tools were found on the skeletons of completely dismembered Neanderthal skeletons, as well as finger bones were discovered with bite marks that are consistent with marks created by Neanderthal teeth. So why did they do it? Well, considering the fact that Neanderthals had very little meat on their bones and that what little meat they have would have lacked the necessary vitamins and minerals needed for survival, scientists believe that the act of cannibalism amongst Neanderthals was much more symbolic. One possible explanation is that Neanderthals ate other Neanderthals to instill fear into enemy tribes attempting to trespass on their territories, or perhaps they ate the enemy tribes themselves in a victory feast after defeating them in war. Another less dark explanation would be that Neanderthals might have eaten their dead relatives as a way to have them live on inside of the living members of their tribe. Nice.
So, Neanderthals are often depicted looking pretty much exactly like modern-day humans, just with bigger brow ridges and more animal pelts. But a few years back, a much freakier depiction of Neanderthals, or Neanderthals, I know there's some people who think it's Neanderthal. Anyway, a depiction of Neanderthals was presented by author Danny Vendramini, who also has an interest in evolutionary biology. He wrote a book called Them and Us: How Neanderthal Predation Created Modern Humans. The main thesis is that Neanderthals weren't these peaceful dummies that we preyed on and killed off. Instead, they were the ones hunting us. He believed Neanderthals were apex predators, the stuff of nightmares, and that they looked a little bit more like this. Yeah, big, mean-looking ape monsters. And he makes some pretty interesting points. I mean, for one, they did have thicker bones than us. They were stockier, stronger. We know from studying their teeth that they hunted and ate meat. He also looked at the shape and size of their eye sockets, theorizing that based on how large they were, it's possible they were able to see in the dark, which is freaky if it's true. Or at least, you know, they had better vision at night than we did. And because these Neanderthals terrorized us for thousands of years, we have this fear of big hairy beasts just etched into our collective psyche. Now, there's a lot of debate here. His book is kind of controversial in the anthropology world, but it's a pretty killer idea. It would make for an awesome movie.
Next on our list, we have the fact that we got a lot wrong about the true nature of Neanderthals, which is pretty disturbing when you think about how much work and tax dollars went into a bunch of scientists coming to the wrong conclusion despite years of research and an endless stream of resources, but whatever. At one point in time, it was believed, as James just stated, that both Neanderthals and humans lived completely separately and that Neanderthals were savages, but research shows that that was just simply not the case. In fact, Neanderthals, like humans, were incredibly resilient and knowledgeable and able to adapt to a wide range of climates. They were also, as James did mention, incredibly skilled and organized hunters who thrived on a certain kind of tribal societal order. But here's the thing, in many instances, Neanderthals did actually live side by side with humans, and they bred with them too, which is why so many of us alive today actually do have traces of Neanderthal DNA, although not all instances of adult encounters were consensual, but more on that in a bit.
In 2018, the bones of a young Neanderthal were discovered, and not only were they the oldest human remains discovered in Poland, the poor thing suffered a pretty brutal death. It had been eaten by some massive prehistoric bird. Man, imagine roaming around at a time where there were birds so big they could eat you. And all you'd be armed with is a sharp rock attached to a stick. They were finger bones found in a cave in Poland. They had been digested, Unfortunately, the bones were too poorly preserved to conduct any DNA analysis, but the lead archaeologist, Powell Valde-Nowak, believes they belonged to a very young Neanderthal, stating they came from a very deep layer of the cave, a few meters below the present surface, a layer that also contained the typical stone tools that would have been used by Neanderthals.
Okay, so I know in my last point I literally just mentioned the fact that Neanderthals were much more sophisticated than we had previously theorized, and while that is true, it doesn't mean that they didn't do some seriously messed up things. It is believed that for over 50,000 years, while some Neanderthal tribes lived peacefully amongst humans, others did not, and those who did not were pretty brutal about it. Turns out Neanderthals who didn't want to hang out with humans still wanted something to do with them, and that something is sex. Scientists believe that in many cases Neanderthals killed and ate human men while forcing human women into intimate adult encounters. Some scientists also theorize that there was a time in which humans were almost completely wiped out by Neanderthals, but luckily humans fought back, and they fought back hard, and they were able to rebuild their civilization and ultimately prevail.
But when Neanderthals weren't attacking us for our bodies, they were looking at the ones around them. Inbreeding. It's something that we kind of frown upon today, to say the least, but throughout history, it was more common than we're comfortable enough to admit, and Neanderthals were no exception, which is gross, but not really shocking in the slightest. There are tons of theories as to how the Neanderthals finally died out. Some researchers think inbreeding could have played a big role. Inbreeding among Neanderthals was common. They often mated with close relatives like cousins, even siblings. This was discovered through analysis of bones and DNA. For example, a Neanderthal toe bone found in Siberia showed that its parents were closely related. So this would have caused problems for them, just like it does in humans today. They had body parts and bones that didn't develop properly, like misshapen kneecaps and vertebrae. Some even kept baby teeth into adulthood. Because of these issues, inbred Neanderthals were, of course, weaker and had a harder time having offspring of their own compared to early humans.
Next up, we have got the fact that it is incredibly possible that Neanderthals did in fact partake in ritual sacrifice, but not the sacrifice of humans, as far as we know. In 1921, bear remains were found inside of a cave in Drachenloch, Switzerland, suggesting the possibility of ritual sacrifices performed by Neanderthals and giving way to the myth of the cult of cave bear. After the discovery, some archaeologists came to the conclusion that the findings meant one thing and one thing only, that the bears killed in the Swiss cave had been part of a coming-of-age / rite of passage ritual performed by young male Neanderthals wanting to prove themselves to their tribe. While that theory is yet to be proved, and very well likely never will be, it's an interesting one nonetheless.
So if you need any more proof as to why Neanderthals were scarier than we often think, let's take a look, talk a bit more about some of these animals they hunted, like the cave bear and the cave lion. I don't think it gets any more ferocious than prehistoric lions and bears. Cave bears were about the same size as modern day brown bears, sometimes larger though, likely weighing in at over 1,500 pounds. Bones of cave lions have been found all over Europe, with the biggest specimens being over 8 feet in length, and that's not even counting the tail. Terrifying. And what's cool is that along with these bones, cave paintings have been found, which gives us a pretty good idea of what these animals would have looked like. Cave lions, for example, didn't look like they had manes of any kind. So yeah, thanks to all our proto-human ancestors for documenting that for us.
Next up, we have another theory that hits pretty close to home, depending on your beliefs, I suppose, and that is that the Neanderthals were wiped out due to climate change and a rising in the human population, and disease, and a decline in biodiversity. Sound familiar? When humans began spreading out over the globe, they became a serious threat to not only Neanderthals, but also the large animals that made up the majority of the Neanderthals' diet, as well as the forest, jungle, and grassland areas that those large animals relied on to survive. You see, humans are not great at sustainability, and so they were killing these large animals at a rate in which they could not recover from. After that, they began wiping out lush areas of trees and grass that the planet so desperately needed to maintain itself. The climate began to change, making it incredibly difficult for Neanderthals to survive. Not only that, but as humans continued to spread across continents, they also spread their diseases. Diseases that, as James said, the inbred Neanderthal immune system systems were just not strong enough to fight off. The combination of a declining ecosystem leading to unmanageable climate change as well as deadly disease is ultimately what led to the extinction of the species. So I guess you have us to thank?
But Neanderthals didn't die out entirely. There are traces of their DNA in us. Unless you're just straight up African, it's likely you have some Neanderthal DNA in you, especially if you're of East Asian or European descent. As Hannah discussed earlier, Neanderthals and modern day humans did interbreed, willingly or not, and some of that DNA still lingers in us to this day. These Neanderthal genes in our DNA can affect things like our immune systems, our skin, our hair, and there are some negative traits believed to have been passed down as well. Traits and adaptations that would have helped Neanderthals 40,000 years ago as they were migrating to new non-African environments, but aren't super helpful now, like sun sensitivity. Apparently people with higher amounts of Neanderthal DNA have higher risks of sun sensitivity. I don't know if this is just a myth or not, but I always heard that if you're someone who looks at the sun and then you sneeze, you might have higher Neanderthal amounts of their DNA in you. I'd always sneeze when I look at the sun. And apparently higher Neanderthal DNA could also be linked with higher rates of depression. So that's all very interesting.
Go get yourself a 23andMe. This is not sponsored, but I know that will tell you how much
It tells you about Neanderthal DNA too?
Yeah, it'll tell you how much
Wow.
you have, and like if you're in like the 99th percentile, like if you have more than this amount of the
Interesting.
population. I'm rambling. This is what I sound like.
Yeah, I've never been too interested in doing it, 23andMe, because I'm like, I think I know where I'm probably from. Well, there you go, folks. I've been your host, James.
I've been your host, Hannah.
Catch you next time.